All right, in this first chapter, we're going to start with taking a closer look at what you're capable of doing in conflict and how well you can utilize certain skills in the middle of a fight. Think of this like learning how to master the use of your steering wheel and your brake and gas pedals. These are basic skills, and before you can learn to use them well on a fast-moving highway, we'll want to make sure that you can master them on an empty parking lot where you can make tons of mistakes without causing any real damage. The first set of capabilities that we need to cover is called emotional regulation and processing. You can think of this kind of like your gas pedal. This capability helps you in being able to speak up, for your voice to be heard, and for you to be truly known by your spouse. Go too light on this regulation pedal, you won't get any movement and your voice will go unheard. Go a little bit too heavy on the gas pedal though, you'll end up flooding emotionally and spinning out your wheels. All right, let's start with a definition of what emotional regulation and processing actually means. Emotional regulation just means the ability to regulate and control the flow of your emotions, or the gas for your car, so to speak. Emotional processing, though, means the ability to dig and to discover the deeper meaning and the underlying meaning for what your emotions are actually about. You can think of that kind of like your car's transmission, the thing that transfers the raw emotional power of your engine to actual movement to your wheels. Emotional processing helps you to understand and make sense of what you're feeling and why. It, in a sense, helps you to understand yourself better so that you can be better understood by others. Now, that might sound simple enough, but this particular skill set can be and often is incredibly difficult to actually do in the middle of a fight. Let me explain why. First, you have to understand what flooding means. Flooding occurs when a trigger or an event happens that causes a flood of emotions, which in turn results in you feeling overwhelmed with intense feelings. You see, when flooding happens, you tend to lose some level of control over your words and behavior. This basically comes down to a brain function that's built into every human being. All people have an upper brain and a lower brain function. Upper brain activity is where we make rational and well thought out decisions. It's part of our brain that allows us to act like the more mature and more ideal version of ourselves. Lower brain activity, though, is where our impulsive and more primal reactions happen. Specifically, it's the brain's amygdala, and it produces what's known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. When our brain interprets a threat or something to be afraid of, the lower brain kicks in and literally overrides the upper brain function. So, for example, if someone threw an object at you, instinctively you might dodge it or duck. Your reaction is purely instinctual. You don't have time to think or rationalize whether you should move or duck out of the way because your lower brain senses the threat and overrides your upper brain decision-making function. So this comes in handy if you're about to be hit by a car while driving, for example, or if you see a snake on the ground. But it's not so helpful when your spouse does or says something hurtful or when you feel attacked by them. Because when you sense a threat or when you're triggered by your spouse, your lower brain kicks in and you experience flooding, the overwhelming sensation that forces you to react, but typically not in ways that are rational or helpful to the relationship. The good news here, though, is that it's completely normal and part of everyone's design. Bad news, though, is that it screws with how you fight in marriage. Oftentimes what happens when people flood is that they lose control over their thoughts and emotions as well as their words and actions. Once you're in lower brain activity, it's hard to control yourself the way that you would if you were in upper brain activity, and you're likely to not even remember things very clearly. It's hard to think straight and for your brain to keep up with the emotions that you're experiencing, almost as though you're pressing too hard on that gas pedal and there's no way to control your car anymore. But there's still more good news in that it's totally something that you can train and harness with practice. You just have to be aware of the phenomenon and develop the muscles to control it better. So something to observe when your lower brain takes over is people usually fight, flee, or freeze. In marriage fighting, that usually means becoming aggressive or pursuing a conflict when it's not the best time at all. That's the fight response. Or avoiding and withdrawing from a conflict, that would be the flee response. Or shutting down emotionally and verbally, that would be the freeze response. You see, couples that fight poorly usually engage one of these lower brain responses, end up having a bad conflict, and rarely ever come back around to redo the fight using their upper brains. It's not uncommon at all for a couple to literally forget what started their fight. They can remember getting into a fight and that the fight was mean and ugly, but they'll have a hard time recollecting what triggered it all. That's because once their lower brain takes over, they're not thinking clearly and logging things in their memory as they would if their upper brain was engaged. This makes it really hard for couples to come back to their fights because they oftentimes don't remember all the parts of what got them so upset in the first place. Now, the only way to overcome a flood when a lower brain hijacks the upper brain is to do a reset, or in other words, call a timeout. That's a concept that we'll dive much more into in the second part of your course when we get into the structure and rules for fighting. But for now, just understand that to use a timeout effectively, you'll have to develop ways to disengage the fight, flight, or freeze response by engaging the upper brain activities. Things like maybe reading a book or doing a crossword puzzle. Tactically, this means calling a timeout with your spouse, disengaging the fight for a period of time so that you can reset your brain and regulate the flood. Once you can do that, you're able to engage the conflict using your upper brain again. Where most couples mess up though is that they stay engaged in lower brain flooding for way too long, saying things that they regret in conflict, then disengage only after damage has been done. But they also never re-engage the fight to handle it better either. So conflicts in marriage never get your best upper brain functioning. Fighting gets associated with poor lower brain functioning, and as a result, conflicts get a bad rap, leaving couples feeling like their conflicts are bad things that should be avoided. Regulating emotions means learning to control the flood and to bring the conflict back into upper brain level of functioning. Learning to do this allows a person to harness the emotions and to understand them better. It helps to think of this like regulating a dam. A dam needs to have some sort of regulator or release valve to allow the flow through of what's behind the dam. Poor emotional regulation means any trigger in a conflict can break the dam, leading to a flood. Good regulation means having a highly controllable and capable release valve that allows for the flow through of emotions, but in such a way that allows a person to understand and actually observe what's going on in that flow of emotions. Not too much, but not too little either. Which leads us to the second part of the skill set, which is processing. Processing means discerning what the emotions are about and what's going on in that flow of emotions and why. You see, for most people, when we get triggered in a conflict and can start to feel our emotions ramp up, it's hard to parse out what we're actually thinking and feeling. In conflict, a lot of what we experience tends to kind of feel like this, a big mess of jumbled thoughts and emotions that's hard to make sense out of. The idea behind regulating is that we need to slow down the flow of those emotions to where we can actually start moving pieces around and start sorting things out to get a better understanding of what we're feeling and why we're feeling it. In essence, the skill set of regulating and processing through the emotions is like hacking a puzzle. At first, if you've never hacked or processed your emotions in a conflict before, it can take you a really long time. It can feel impossible. But much like this Rubik's Cube here, if you learn a process and a few steps to do over and over again, eventually you'll learn to figure it out. And even more, you'll get faster and faster in doing it, making it easier for you to process your thoughts and feelings while you're in the middle of a conflict. So let's learn a little bit about how to hack your emotional processing. Let's start with step one, which is identifying and spotting your primary emotions. Anger, fear, and pain are usually the first and most powerful emotions that a person can feel when they're in lower brain mode. These are primary emotions, and your lower brain is really only wired to experience these emotions. They're meant to come on strong so that you can react quickly without much thought. But the upper brain function is able to distill those emotions a little bit more and pick out more subtle secondary emotions like shame, rejection, and loneliness. A lot of times, a conflict, particularly when we're flooded, all we know and what we feel is this big nebulous ball of emotions. But emotional processing allows you to parse out those feelings and to actually pick out more subtle and pinpointed secondary emotions. So instead of feeling this big overwhelming flood of anger and fear, you can process out more subtle feelings like hurt and neglect and abandonment or shame. Processing out and surfacing underlying emotions helps to give more understanding and context to a fight. It gives you better information to work with, which in turn helps a couple to resolve their conflict at deeper and more lasting levels. Now, the next step involves a tool that I call a BTF process. It stands for behavior, thought, and feeling. Think of this as a processing tool like the transmission for your car. It helps you break up all that raw emotional power into smaller and more manageable chunks. So the way the BTF tool works is it requires you to split your trigger in a conflict up into three distinct parts: the behavior, the thought, and the feeling. The behavior is the trigger. It's the thing that actually starts the conflict for you. The thought is the message or rationale that the behavior or trigger communicates to you. And the feeling is the corresponding secondary or more distilled and processed emotion that goes along with that message. So for example, when you say things like, "that's stupid," That would be the behavior or trigger. It communicates to me that you somehow think that you're better than me or that you're smarter than me. That would be the rationale, which makes me feel inadequate, like I'm not enough and I'm rejected. That would be the secondary emotion or feeling. You see, research shows that if a couple can break their conflicts down into those three components, they stand a much higher chance of resolving their conflicts well. The trick is being able to identify and pull out the emotions and feelings that go beyond anger, frustration, fear, to really get down into those secondary emotions, which is why emotional regulation and moving from primary to secondary emotions is such an important skill set to have. Regulating your emotion allows you to control the flow of emotions and draw out more depth from those feelings, things that are near next to impossible when you're flooded and functioning in that lower brain space. Okay, that wraps up this first section of the chapter, which introduced you to the concepts of emotional regulating and processing. Now, this was just a quick introduction to these skills, and for the purposes of trying to keep this course focused on handling conflict in your marriage, I really didn't go into as much detail on how to develop those skills. Now, definitely talking with a coach or a therapist can help, since we're trained to help you process. But if you want to do more work on your own without the help of a coach or a therapist, be sure to check out some of the other courses that I have or that I should be producing shortly that focuses more on how to process and to dig into what your thoughts and emotions are actually about and why you experience them the way that you do. In the next section of this chapter, we'll introduce you to emotional resiliency and empathy.